Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Grueninger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Talking Tudors. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger. Thank you so much for joining me. I always like to begin by thanking the wonderful listeners who continue to support my podcast on Patreon and extending a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. This really does make a difference. If you love the podcast and you never miss an episode, I invite you to join the Talking Tudors patron family. Visit patreon.com/talkingtudors for more information. Join the Talking Tudors patron family, and in addition to receiving lots of Tudor-themed goodies, you'll have access to patron-only monthly giveaways. April's prize is a copy of The Carnival of Ash. A huge thank you to Solaris Books for sponsoring this great prize. Patrons are also eligible to attend additional monthly talks that take place live on Zoom. Next month, I'll be chatting to Illyri Lynn about Tudor textiles and fashion. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. There are a number of designs and products available, including phone cases, mugs, notebooks, and apparel. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. I'd love to see pics of you wearing or using your Talking Tudors merch, so please do tag me on social media and use the hashtag #ILoveTalkingTudors. Now, on to today's episode. I'm absolutely thrilled that joining me on the show to talk about Anne de Graville is Dr. Elizabeth Lestrange. Elizabeth was born in London and studied for a BA in English Language and Literature, an MA in Medieval Studies, and a PhD in Art History at the University of Leeds. Her first book, Holy Motherhood, Gender, Dynasty and Visual Culture in the Later Middle Ages, was published in 2008 as an interdisciplinary study of images of maternity in books of hours and their interpretation by aristocratic viewers. She has published widely on women patrons and book owners in France in the late 15th and early 16th century, especially Anne of France and Anne of Brittany. She's currently Associate Professor, Senior Lecturer in the Department of Art History, Curating and Visual Studies at the University of Birmingham. She's now preparing an edition translation of Anne de Graville's Beaux Romans and Rondeaux with Joan E. McCrae. Our conversation's coming up straight after this short musical break, courtesy of guitarist Jon Sayles. Welcome to Talking Tudors, Elizabeth. How are you?
Thank you very much for having me, Natalie. I'm very pleased to be here.
It's lovely. I've been looking forward to this chat. So I suppose a good place to begin is you just introducing yourself to our listeners and just telling everyone a little bit about you and your background.
Well, I'm now a senior lecturer at the University of Birmingham. I work in the Department of Art History, Curating and Visual Studies, and I joined there in 2011. And before that, I spent some time in research posts in French-speaking Belgium. And before that, I did a degree in English, language and literature at the University of Leeds, where I discovered an interest in medieval gender studies. We were reading texts like The Wife of Bath and the Ancra Louisa. And then I stayed on at Leeds, where I did an MA in medieval studies, where I learned a lot more about manuscripts, and especially about books of hours and about Christine de Pisan and Boccaccio. And then I went on and did a PhD in art history at Leeds, working specifically on books of hours and especially on images of maternity and motherhood and how these would have been interpreted by women who might have been expected to produce heirs for a dynasty. And I suppose I've got quite an eclectic background: literature, art history, manuscript studies, history of the book, and that's kind of come together in the latest study of Anne de Graville.
Yes, and we are here to talk about your new book, which I received just a couple of days ago, which is absolutely stunning, by the way. Congratulations.
Thank you.
So Anne de Graville, I like how you pronounce it, I'll copy you, and Women's Literary Networks in Early Modern France. So what was the inspiration for this book? Maybe just tell us a little bit about how it came about.
Well, I worked in the course of my PhD and in my first book. I worked quite a lot on Anne of Brittany, who was Claude of France's mother, and also on Anne of Brittany's sister-in-law, Anne of France. And so I kind of had a sense of who Claude was, and that she was getting quite a lot of attention from other scholars, including a good friend of mine, Kathleen Wilson-Chevalier, who sort of put me on the piste of Anne de Graville and said, oh, she's written this interesting work for Claude. That would be something to sort of maybe work up into a paper or a conference paper. And I started that, and it quickly became apparent that Anne was far more interested in just a conference paper or a short article. So I got a sense of her having a library and being quite a key person at the French court, and then these works that she wrote for these women at the court as well. So yeah, it became a much bigger decade-long project. So yeah, that's how it all began, really.
And so for people that maybe haven't heard of her before, who was she? Can you tell us a little bit about maybe her family, that sort of thing?
Yeah, she was the third daughter, the youngest child of Louis de Graville and his wife, Marie de Balzac. Louis de Graville was the Admiral of France. So he had quite an important job sort of running the navy, as it was. And he was close to quite a few French kings. So he served under several successive kings of France. And his wife, Marie de Balzac, was also from an aristocratic family with connections to the French monarchy. So they had 3 children. The family was of Norman origin. So they had land and property in Normandy, but they obviously also must have spent time close to the king in Paris and the Loire Valley. We don't know much about Anne's early life. She probably was born in about 1490. She had 2 older sisters, Jeanne and Louise. And we don't know her date of death either. We think she died around 1540, when the records seem to sort of, there's no more indication of her in various records. But her parents were bibliophiles. They had their own collections of manuscripts. Louis was also an important patron of arts and sculpture. So we can imagine that she was brought up in a world that was sort of imbued with literature and manuscripts, illuminated manuscripts and art. And that's perhaps where she got her own love of books from, was from her parents' collection. And she goes on to inherit some of those later on. In 1507, she married her cousin, Pierre de Balzac, which was not a union that her father was very keen on, and in fact tried to prosecute Pierre for abducting his daughter. So we might imagine that she had perhaps a strong character and wanted to sort of follow her own path. That's quite the romantic reading. But the marriage lasted. They had lots of children, and she does honour Pierre in one of her manuscripts. His art coat of arms appears there. She uses a joint coat of arms. So we can imagine that this perhaps was a union of love. But it did cause her to be disinherited by her father in the first instance. So she's written out of the will. There are various sort of slightly 19th century romantic readings of her trying to be reconciled with her father, but she doesn't get reinstated until after his death. So after Louis dies in 1516, she contests the will and her inheritance, and she does a deal with her sister and her surviving nieces and nephews, and manages in 1518 to get her share of Louis's books and movable goods. And in 1520, she gets some of his property as well. So she's quite tenacious. And it's after 1520 that we start to see more of Anne in the historical record. So perhaps the resolution of her inheritance led to a better financial situation. So she can buy books, she can commission more things.
Yes, I think I first came across her when I was doing some research into Anne Boleyn's early life. That's who I study. And of course, she spent time in, well, we think in the service of Queen Claude, although there's no archival record of Anne being there. And I believe it's the same for our Anne that we're discussing today. Is that right?
It is, yeah. There's a lot of some of the early work on Anne de Graville, and some of that dates from the late 19th, early 20th century, sort of just states she was in the service of Claude of France. She was a dame d'honneur of Claude of France. But I haven't found any record of that at all. Maybe she was. What I did find was there are some references to a Dame d'Entraigues, which was the seigneurie of Pierre de Balzac, so another name for Anne de Graville, in the service of Margaret of Navarre up until about 1529. So she may have been in Margaret's service, but then Margaret was the sister-in-law of Claude, so it would have brought her into the same kind of circles. And yeah, and she did even meet Anne Boleyn. I mean, she did spend time at Claude's court. They might have crossed paths, and even, you know, possible that Anne de Graville was at the Field of the Cloth of Gold from some of the references that she makes in her work. So she was definitely in that milieu, and she writes a book at the request of the Queen. So she must have known the Queen, or the Queen must have felt that she wanted Anne to write something for her. So she was obviously in the right circles, even if she wasn't necessarily in her service.
Okay, so before we look at the two poetic works that Anne authored in the 1520s, tell us about the debate that emerged in France in the 15th century, known as the Querelle des Dames, or the controversy about women.
Yeah, so it's a very complex and interesting debate. There are lots of ways in which we could say that the Querelle des Femmes began and where its origins are. But I suppose for the period we're looking at in the 15th century, we might say it began with Christine de Pizan taking issue with the negative portrayal of women in much contemporary literature and in sermons and in devotional and religious texts. So Christine de Pizan was another female writer at the French court 100 years before Anne de Graville. She had to earn a living by writing because she lost her husband and had a family to support. And she doesn't just write about women, she writes about a lot of things, but she's probably perhaps best known for her defense of women. So she was particularly appalled by the way women were portrayed in a text known as the Romance of the Rose, which sort of implies women are devious and cunning and casts them in a very negative light. And she gets into a big epistolary debate about the pros and cons of the Romance of the Rose and its authors, there were two of them. And this kind of leads her, I think, to enter into a desire to defend women from these negative criticisms. And she writes the City of Ladies, the book of the City of Ladies, which is a catalogue of famous women who have done amazing things in their lifetimes. They're generally classical women. There aren't very many contemporary women or even Christian women in the city. But it's about sort of revalorising women's contribution to society. And she models her catalogue on Boccaccio's De Mulieribus Claris. Boccaccio was also purportedly defending women in his catalogue, but he undercuts them at every opportunity. So he sort of says, oh, she was a great queen, but she was, you know, not very good at doing this, that, and the other. But Christine is much more into showing off women's moral virtues, their ability to rule, their ability to act as educators, and generally as being good citizens and not to be defamed by men. So this is the context at the beginning of the 15th century. And this sparks lots of other works like Martin Lefranç's Champion des Dames, which is also a text written in defence of women. And I think Anne de Graville is she's aware of this, she's probably read some of these works, and that's what is kind of partly inspiring her own writings.
So tell us about Anne's poetic works.
So she wrote two surviving works and a short poem, a rondeau, which is in a manuscript and was also printed by Geoffroy Toury in the Champfleury. But the two works that I focused on in the book are the Beau Roman, which I think I mentioned previously was written at the behest of the Queen of France, Queen Claude, and the Rondeau, which I discovered in the writing of the book was written for Louise of Savoy and not for Claude of France. So the Beau Roman is a rewriting of Boccaccio's Teseida, which is also the source for Chaucer's Knight's Tale. But Anne doesn't seem to have translated the work directly from Boccaccio's Italian. She's working from a mid-15th century mise en prose, a prose version of the book of Theseus. And this is a copy that she has in her library, We know the copy that she had is now in the Bodleian in Oxford. Generally, it's a story of two lovers, Palamon and Arcita, who are vying for the hand of Emilia, who is an Amazon princess, the sister of Hippolyta, an Amazon queen. But the original Boccaccio tale is very long and has all kinds of other bits to the story. And what Anne does is she massively truncates the story. So it focuses specifically on the tale of Emilia and these two men who are kind of fighting for her hand in marriage. And again, whereas in Boccaccio and indeed in Chaucer's version, Emily's a rather passive figure. She doesn't have much agency. She doesn't speak very much. Anne de Graville makes her Emilia much more proactive, gives her much more agency, gives her much more kind of interior speech and direct speech. And that makes her very compassionate. And she comes across as a kind of mediating figure between these two men who are kind of, she doesn't know which one to choose, and she's trying to appease both of them. And I wonder whether she's holding up a mirror perhaps to Claude of France and sort of suggesting perhaps this is the way you might negotiate these male rivalries that are happening at the French court at the same time. So Francis I is caught up in a lot of rivalries with Henry VIII. He's caught up in rivalries with Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and also with his own constable, Charles de Bourbon-Montpensier. And the Beau Roman is written at the time just after probably the Field of the Cloth of Gold, when Francis has met up with Henry to do a kind of deal over certain things. Obviously, all falls apart. And Anne makes reference to, I've been to Ardres and I've seen these magnificent princes. And she describes Palamon and Arcita in terms that could conceivably be Francis I and Henry VIII. So I think she's updating a very classical story with reference to the French court. So there's also politics going on, I think, in the background of this text too. And the Rondeau is another rewriting. So I think this is something that Anne was interested in, is kind of retellings of stories. The Rondeau is a rewriting of Alain Chartier's 1424 poem, La Belle Dame sans Merci. And this poem was in itself very controversial. So it causes its own querelle, it has its own controversy and debate when it's first written. So it's about a lover who wants to seduce a lady, and it's a conversation between the two of them, and the lady is having none of it. She really doesn't want to be seduced by this lover, and she comes up with all kinds of arguments as to why they're not going to have a relationship. And the lover then ends up sort of disappearing at the end of the story, and we are led to understand that he probably dies. And it caused a huge amount of debate amongst readers and other poets who found the lady either too uncourtly and sort of cruel to the lover, and others who thought, well, she's standing in her position, she has the right to say no to this man who's making these advances towards her. So there are lots of responses to the poem that put the lady on trial, that kind of acquit her. And these poems are collected in manuscript copies that circulate at courts, particularly at the court of Blois, headed up by Marie de Clèves and Charles d'Orléans. And so I think Anne was sort of entering into another querelle in rewriting this Belle Dame sans Merci. And like the Beau Roman, she truncates her source. So she chops off the sort of beginning of the poem, which is introduced by an actor, and then she kind of goes straight into the debate between the lover and the lady. And what she also does is she transforms Chartier's 8-line verses, into 13-line rondeaux. So she has more words to play with, more words and more lines to play with. But the really interesting thing about this text, which only survives in one copy, is that she includes Chartier's original poems in the margins of the manuscript. So you have a sort of debate going on between Chartier's original poem in the margin and Anne's rewriting of it on the main page. And what she does is she takes words from Chartier, takes phrases from his poem and uses them, but sometimes turns them upside down and uses them in a different way. So you have this interesting debate going on between the lover and the lady all the way through. And you also have the debate between Anne de Graville and one of the masters of French poetry, Alain Chartier. So it's quite an audacious move, I think, and a deliberate mise en page, a deliberate setting out of the poems on the page to sort of get the reader engaged in that debate, which I think then reflects the debate that had been happening in sort of 50 or so years earlier between the different voices in the poem. And the curious thing about this poem is that all the prologues there are 6 copies of the Beau Roman, and in all 6 copies, bar one, I think, the prologue is addressed à la reine, to the queen, sometimes à la reine Claude. So we know for certain that the Beau Roman was made for Claude, and there is an image of her being given the book by Anne de Graville in the Arsenal copy. But the Rondeau always struck me as slightly odd because the prologue is addressed à Madame. And people always said, oh, it's the earlier of the two works. And I kept thinking, what is it? Claude before she became queen? Is it to my lady Claude? And then something didn't quite sit right with me about it. And I sort of started digging around. And I mean, it's just serendipity or luck or whatever, lockdown, late night Googling. But I found what must be the missing frontispiece from the copy of the poem. And it was somehow it must have been detached, and it was inserted into a different manuscript of a similar date, a copy of religious poems and prayers. And it shows a woman giving a book to Louise of Savoy. It cannot be anyone other than Louise of Savoy because it has anagrams of her name, it has her coat of arms, she's dressed like a widow, as she is in many other manuscripts. And the backside of the page has the title, La Belle Dame sans merci, mise en rondeau.
What an incredible find, where you just over the moon.
Yeah, and then but the complete irony of that is that at the end of the article, where this is just not really discussed, it's not actually the object of the paper, it's something else, but it happens to have been produced by the author. At the end, there's a small note saying, unfortunately, the manuscript in question has been lost from the convent in Nantes where it was being housed. So I found it, and then it immediately was lost again. No. So it's out there now in the book. So perhaps if the book resurfaces, it's probably, I don't know, in the back of a cupboard in a convent somewhere.
Yeah.
In France. It just made sense because Madame, I mean, Louise of Savoy was known as Madame, and it suggests to me that the Rondeau was the second of the two works because the miniature shows Louise sort of enthroned, and next to her there's a smaller throne with a kind of crown sitting on it, and it suggests, and she's sort of surrounded by these courtiers, and Anne's giving her the book, and it sort of suggests to me that this is the period of Louise's second regency, when Francis I has gone off to Italy and then he's captured and taken to Spain. And it's Louise who's protecting the kingdom. The empty throne is kind of within her canopy. And perhaps that Claude has already died as well. She dies in 1524. So this is about Louise's sort of 2 years of when she's in charge of the kingdom. And it would be a logical step for Anne to turn from Claude to Louise if once Claude has died. So that's my theory. And there's the certain emblems around Louise's canopy suggest that this is also related to her kind of claiming of the Duchy of Bourbon. So again, which is happening at this time as well. It was a kind of eureka moment.
Oh yes. I can just imagine. And just for our listeners, these images that Elizabeth's discussing are in the book, and they are beautiful, beautiful. I've been drooling over them just before we were talking. So if anyone wants to see those, I recommend getting a copy. So what you mentioned that obviously Christine de Pizan was one of her influences, probably. Were there any other works or people that you think maybe influenced Anne's work? And what do you think ultimately, what is she hoping to achieve through these poems?
Well, I think she's definitely aware of and interested in Christine de Pizan. I mean, we don't have an inventory of Anne's library. What I've done in the book is try to reconstruct a sense of what is extant that she owned. And within that, I've identified there are 2 copies of the Mutation de Fortune by Christine de Pizan that she owned and she annotated. And you wouldn't describe those as being Christine's most sort of pro-feminine works, but they are about a woman having to take control of her life. And it's a mutation. She's transformed into a man by Lady Fortune so that she can carry on kind of steering the ship of her family through these difficult times. And there are lots of references in the Mutation de Fortune to Amazons and other kinds of women from sort of classical history. So I think that was something that was influencing Anne de Graville, and we can possibly assume that she knew other works by Christine, even if we don't have any tangible evidence of that. So I think she was sort of developing Christine's legacy, and I wonder whether she doesn't feel a kind of affinity with this woman who was also working at the French court 100 years earlier. And Anne's family had a long history of service to the French kings and queens, and they were very much sort of present around the time of Charles V and then Charles VI and Charles VII and Joan of Arc. So I think she has lots of books in her collection that are sort of memorializing the Graville family lineage. So I think she's sort of, I like to think that across the century, the 2 women were sort of somehow connected, and they both suffered from the vagaries of fortune. I mean, Christine de Pizan loses her husband and her father, and she sort of finds herself in some grave difficulties trying to sort of bring up her young family. And Anne de Graville is disinherited by her father and sort of has to kind of get on with life. And perhaps there's a similarity there. So I think she's developing that legacy of Christine. And I think she's also drawing inspiration from the other works in her library. So we find references to stories that she embellishes certain bits of the beau roman with stories that come out of other copies of things that she has in her library. We might wonder who she's writing for, apart from the Queen and for Louise of Savoy, because there are so few copies of these books. Exactly, there's 6 copies of the beau roman and 1 of the Rondeau. Are they for circulation amongst a small group of elite women? Are they designed perhaps to be in sort of guides on how to behave, perhaps how to sort of reinterpreting Christine's advice in a new context? So it's difficult to say, but she doesn't seem to be promoting her works beyond a very small manuscript reading circle. She doesn't go for print. She lives in the age of print, but she only has 1 printed book in her library, and perhaps she's just more interested in this kind of circulation amongst a small coterie of women readers.
So let's talk a little bit about Anne the reader and collector now. So what books and manuscripts did she have? You've mentioned a couple obviously already in her library, and what do they tell us about her interests, her beliefs, and even her collecting practice as well?
So we could sort of divide her library into sort of different sections, really. She has a group of manuscripts that she inherits from her parents, but she doesn't inherit those until the resolution of the inheritance debate around. She's written, the books are written in them, inherited in 1518 from the collection of her father Louis. That's that group there. There are some books that she buys secondhand in Rouen. There's 5 or 6 books that in 1521, 1522 she's written in them, bought in Rouen, and the date, and they're not particularly pretty manuscripts. They're quite old. Perhaps she's bought them for the texts that are inside. She's not bought them for the aesthetic value. There are certain books that she receives as gifts. So one of the earliest books in her collection must be the Chaldean Histories, which is the image on the front cover of the book. And that was probably commissioned for her by her husband, Pierre de Balzac. There's an interesting prologue at the start, which addresses her and says the book has been produced. I was made to make the book by love, as a way of kind of giving you some consolation for these tribulations through which you're going at the moment. And I think it's probably a reference to the marriage debacle. And it's a beautifully illustrated frontispiece that puts Anne sort of very much centre stage. She's in the process of receiving the book from a sort of disembodied hand. And it's a translation of some books purportedly written by Berosus, but actually written by a 15th century Italian who had pretended he'd found some books by the ancient author, the Chaldean priest Berosus. And I think it's an early indication of Anne's interest in translation, in sort of these books are related to sort of French history and tracing the lineages of the European houses back to Troy. And so I think Pierre had it made to honour Anne and her kind of emerging literary interests. And that's a thread that we can see running through her collection, is this interest in what we call remaniement in French, kind of like reworkings, translations, in the sort of sense of not just from one language to another, but from one poetic form to another. So she has several books as well that relate to the history of the Graville families, I think I mentioned before, some of which kind of come from her parents' collection. She has some romances. She seems to like chansons de geste, so she has quite a lot of old, as in old text and old copies of text, so sort of 12th, 13th, 14th century texts in 12th, 13th, 14th century copies. And then she has also this wonderful copy of Petrarch's Triumphs that she commissioned probably in Rouen in 1520, 1525, again around this time where she's more active and seems to have more money. There's a lot of interest in Petrarch's Triumphs in Rouen at this time in France. Lots of Petrarch's manuscripts come back from the Italian campaigns through the Cardinal Georges d'Amboise, and there's lots of sort of, the theme of the triumph is sort of present in the city in various different forms. And I think the commissioning of this copy of the triumphs, which is related to a copy owned by the Cardinal Georges d'Amboise, sort of situates her very much in kind of Norman literary culture and her links to kind of Norman aristocracy. So I think her collection is about sort of shaping her identity as a woman. Interested because there's certain books in her collection that kind of relate to the Querelle des Femmes, even if they're not specifically Querelle texts, but books that have complicated or problematic female figures in them. It's also about situating her, yes, within her Norman heritage. She's given a book by the prince, or the kind of what you call the Prince du Puy, is the prince of the poetry competition that's held in Rouen every year. She's given a copy of the winning poems from 1524. And these are prefaced by a long prologue that extols Anne de Graville and her family and her Norman origins. So again, she seems to have been quite well known, and the collection seems to sort of situate her in that kind of milieu. She also has romance texts, and as I said, only one printed work, which is quite unusual for the 1520s, perhaps.
Yeah.
But it's a work, again, it's a translation. It's a copy of Virgil's Georgics, and it's printed sort of with the French translation with bits of the Latin in the margins. And that's also a sort of feature of her Petrarch manuscript. She has the translation with the Petrarch sort of around, and the commentaries around the edge. So again, that link between, debate between texts that's happening within books, I think, is something that crops up in her library. And the other interesting thing that I noticed is that she seems to be interested in having, as I said, she's interested in reworkings and copies, but she owns 6 texts in different redactions. So she owns 2 copies of the Mutation de Fortune, but one is not a copy of the other. It's 2 different versions, from 2 different versions of the original text. She owns 2 copies of the Histoire ancienne jusqu'à César in 2 different redactions. She owns a prose version and a poetry version of Ami et Amil. So I think she's deliberately seeking out things that she already owns to complement them, perhaps to see how people have reworked them, perhaps to complement or to fill in gaps in certain texts that she has that have different information in other versions. So it's a very interesting kind of feature of her library.
Absolutely. And so you said that she's writing for it seems to be writing for a fairly sort of small audience. What links does she have, though, to other women writers of the time?
So she is the sister-in-law of Catherine d'Amboise. And Catherine d'Amboise is the niece of the Cardinal Georges d'Amboise, who I mentioned is active in Rouen. And Catherine she's been the subject of renewed interest recently as well. There's been a new edition of her works published. And she, like Anne, I think, is interested in the position of women in society. Her works are a lot more biographical. And she's also the sort of victim of fortune. She loses her husband, she loses her son. But she's Anne's sister-in-law by marriage. And I think that they possibly shared literary interests, and they were perhaps moving in the same circles around in Bourges. And I mean, Bourges it's in the Duchy of Margaret of Navarre, who we know Anne probably had links to. And Margaret's secretary, Jacques Thibault, or Thibaust, I'm not quite sure how you pronounce these old French names, and his wife, Jeanne de la Font, had a literary salon in Bourges. And Jeanne de la Font also rewrote Boccaccio's Teseida, but this is a work that's also been lost. So we don't know whether she wrote it like Anne did from the French version or whether she translated from the Italian, but there's obviously something going on there with Boccaccio. And Anne's sister, Jeanne de Graville, was also linked to Bourges because she becomes quite involved with the Annonciade convent that's founded by Jeanne of France, the sister of Charles VIII. So I can sort of imagine that there's perhaps Catherine, Jeanne, who might have received a copy of Catherine d'Amboise's works, Margaret of Navarre, who's also, her writings also show a kind of familiarity with Chartier and a familiarity with the Querelle des Femmes, that they're perhaps, they maybe take the opportunity to sit and discuss these literary characters. The Belle Dame sans Merci. Jacques Thibault has a very important copy, a very late but very complete copy of the sort of complete works of the Querelle de la Belle Dame sans Merci, and he has annotations in them, and some of those annotations match readings in Anne's copy of the Rondeau. So you can sort of imagine that these women, and indeed perhaps men, were sort of sitting around discussing these various literary incarnations and how to approach them and rewrite them. And also when you look at some of Catherine d'Amboise's manuscripts, they're sharing illuminators, perhaps they're in the same circles and sharing information about, perhaps you'd like to have this illuminator come and do your book, and perhaps you'd like a copy of this, and we can imagine all sorts of things. But I think there was definitely what I try to trace in the book is a kind of, rather than seeing Christine de Pizan at the beginning of the 15th century as a kind of the only woman fighting for the defense of women, is to sort of see how her legacy is then picked up by other women in different ways, and how the querelle actually sort of evolves and changes. And so I also look a little bit at Anne of France, who I mentioned earlier, who's a sister of Charles VIII and reigned as regent for one. She writes a book for her daughter called the Enseignement, my lessons for my daughter. And it's not sort of perhaps pro-feminist in the same way as Christine de Pizan's, but she's about sort of telling her daughter how to run a household, how to be strong, how to manage her life as a as an aristocratic woman. And I think, and that book gets printed. So there's possibilities that Anne and her entourage read Anne of France's work. And then, these things kind of get picked up on, and we can kind of get a sort of sense of the longue durée, I suppose, of Christine's legacy and how it gets transformed by the way women write about each other, not just by the way men write about women, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And just out of interest, does Anne's religious views play a part in her work?
I don't know. The thing is with Anne's religious views is that there's not a lot of information out there. We know that she was probably interested in, or certainly interested in, the religious reform that was happening in the sort of 1510s, 1520s in France, and in which Margaret of Navarre was very much implicated, and also probably Claude of France. She shelters two evangelical reformers at her castle. We have a letter that says, Pierre Caroli, for instance, says that he's been given shelter at the castle of Madame d'Entraigues in 1525-26, I think. And he's sort of being exiled. Ends up in Geneva or somewhere. So she's obviously got some connections with the religious reform movement, but I searched and I couldn't really find any other strong indicators of that. And in her library, there are relatively no religious or devotional works. I mean, there's a book of hours that was probably made for her parents, that some people have suggested she might have inherited, or her husband might have inherited, perhaps been adapted for them. But there's no book of hours that belong to Anne de Graville that I found. And there are no sort of obviously pro-evangelical or religious texts. But we can imagine, again, if she was in it's the same thing's happening in England. If she was in the sort of circle of Anne Boleyn early on in her life, and we know that her father's also very interested in reform as well, but perhaps not to the same extent as later reformers. So it's a strange one. But I think that the lack of sort of specific devotional texts in her library also encourages us to think, well, what does make a women's library? And is it worth thinking about women's libraries in a different way? And are women's libraries a thing as opposed to men's libraries? Because there's been a lot of work on digging out, kind of bringing women's libraries to light and sort of trying to characterize them in particular ways, which has been really helpful for, feminist scholarship and sort of seeing things in a different way. But now I'm beginning to wonder with Anne's library whether we just need to assess them on their own merits, like we might a men's library. So it's about her interests, her interest in her family history, her interest in, or not in, religion, her interest in literature, rather than just sort of trying to group women together as readers of devotional and romance texts. So I think that's been an interesting thought process.
And so Queen Claude dies fairly young in 1524. So you've talked a little bit about Anne's life after that, but what do we know about what became of her following the Queen's death?
Well, I think we know more about her after the Queen's death than perhaps we did before. Or we know most about Anne de Graville in the archives in the period between the resolution of her inheritance, 1518, 1520, and some dates in 1530 and something, maybe 1535, 36. So I think she's established, by the time Claude dies, she's established as a writer. She seems to have a literary reputation. So she writes the Beau Roman, which she's copied in 6 manuscripts. And then we find her, just before that, she's buying these secondhand books in Rouen. She orders her copy of Petrarch's Triumphs around 1524, 25 maybe. She's given the copy of the Puy poetry in 1524. She seems to have written the Rondeau for Louise of Savoy 1524 to 26. And then she's sheltering these evangelicals again in the mid-decade. So I wonder whether she's, again, it's going to makes me wonder how much she was really relying on Claude in the first place, and how much she was sort of building up her network and her connections and her reputation. And she just happened to, but she was close enough to Claude to write a work for her, but she wasn't sort of reliant on Claude to the same extent that we might assume. And then when Claude dies, she's kind of left destitute. I think she's pretty savvy in what she's doing, and she seems to have property, and she turns her attention to Louise of Savoy. We don't know how she experienced the demise of the Queen, but I get the impression that she was, perhaps a move towards Louise of Savoy was also savvy. Perhaps she was, there are indications that perhaps Anne de Graville's family was closer to the side of the defecting Constable of France, Charles de Beaumont-Montpensier, because of previous family allegiances, and perhaps she was sort of trying to negotiate her place at the court by moving swiftly from this kind of disgraced constable. He's disgraced in sort of 1525, and then this is the same time that she's writing for Louise of Savoy. But I think she seems to be pretty stable, and so you sort of wonder how much she was ever reliant on Claude, and how much she was sort of building up her own using her funds and her reputation and her connections to sort of stabilize her life.
And I have one more question for you about Anne, and that's just in terms of the books that she owned. Did you find that many of them are still extant today?
There is no inventory of her books at all. So the manuscripts that I list and I discuss in the book are mainly extant copies. So I've found something sort of 30 odd that we can place in her possession. There are a few more that she possibly owned that we can't quite prove that she owned. And there are a couple that have disappeared. Some are disappeared as in some are in private collections and so can't access them. A couple that are referenced in catalogues that now we don't know where they are. But yes, but it is quite exciting to be able to look at a group of 2 or 3 dozen manuscripts and think Anne probably or actually did once hold some of these. As I said, it's very eclectic. She's got the ones from her parents, which are often quite highly illuminated and quite high quality. I mean, the copy of the Mutation de Fortune that she likely inherited from her mother is one made under Christine de Pizan's supervision. So not only are you holding a book that Anne held, but probably a book that Christine de Pizan maybe held before her. And other ones are sort of much less unassuming. And some of the copies of the Beau Roman are likely written in Anne's hand. One of them may be a kind of autograph copy, or you see annotations in the margin. So again, there's that kind of nice connection to her actual poetic practice. So.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's very powerful, I think, holding something that they once held.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Well, Elizabeth, we've come to the time of the episode where we do a little 10 to go. So 10 questions just to get to know you a little bit better.
Okay.
Nothing too tricky. So the first one is, what is the last film or perhaps a series that you watched?
I'm in the middle of watching Designated Survivor. Which because sometimes in the evening you just want to just like chill out completely and watch something that doesn't take too much brain power. Exactly. Perhaps I should have said it was, I don't know, I should have said it was The Crown or
No, that's absolutely fine. So what about a book that you've gone back to and read more than once?
I used to read books several times in the past. I don't tend to do it so much anymore, but I did read Captain Corelli's Mandolin at least twice, I think. As a kid, I read everything twice.
That's perfect. And what about a favourite holiday destination?
Well, every year we go to the south of France, to the same village, Saint-Chinian, where there's lovely wine. It's not too touristy. There's lots of lovely scenery. You can just chill out. The market is amazing. So other than that, Italy, Florence.
And when you were a child, what did you hope to be when you were older?
Oh, goodness me. I think I probably went through the whole gamut of I want to be a nurse, I want to be a teacher, I want to be an artist. And then I think I went to university and thought, I like this researching lark. What can I do to stay in this?
Fabulous. And what's something that you love about where you live?
Well, in Birmingham, we have on the campus, we have an amazing art gallery called the Barber Institute of Fine Arts. And it's not just a gallery, it's also a concert space. So it's also art and music, but it has the most exquisite collection of European painting from sort of Simone Martini up until the 1950s, Auerbach and people like that. And it's a pleasure to be able to work in the building and then take my students upstairs to just look at these works firsthand. It's a real gem of a collection.
And what do you do to relax and unwind and kind of switch off from all the work?
Well, I play the violin and the viola, and I've been having viola lessons. It started during the confinement, and I just decided I wanted to have something else to do other than writing a book. So I play the viola to myself, sometimes in some small string orchestras, and I play the piano as well. So and I do lino cutting, animals and scenery, that kind of thing. That's my chill out, go-to stuff, art and music.
Lovely, lovely. And what's a favourite historic site or historic house that you like to visit?
Well, I had a fabulous time in probably about 10 years ago, when we were footloose and fancy free and didn't have a child, going around the Loire Valley. And we visited many of the chateaux in the Loire Valley that were inhabited by Anne of France, Anne of Brittany, by Claude. We went to Blois, and there was an amazing, in one of the castles, I think it's in Loche, there is someone will correct me if I'm wrong, a tiny chapel entirely decorated with Anne of Brittany's cordelier and ermine, her kind of personal symbols. And it's tiny, but the whole place is just the pillars, the walls, the niche where the oratory where she put it was all decorated just for her. And I had to admit that I hopped over the barrier that was the cord barrier that was up just so I could take some photographs.
Yeah. That sounds wonderful. I was in the Loire Valley last year and it was beautiful, but I didn't see that one, so I must have missed that.
I think it's one of the less attractive castles on the outside.
Right. Okay.
It's tucked away in a corner somewhere.
Now, I already know the answer to this, I think, because I've seen some today, but do you have any pets, or you currently have any pets?
Well, there's a cat that belongs to the neighbour,
right.
Who is called Scarlett. And she, during lockdown, she spent a lot of time asleep on my sofa. So she was the kind of teaching companion. And she's a bit comes and goes. She blows hot and cold. At the moment, she's on a phase where she wants to come and pester us. It's a kind of shared custody.
Lovely. Yeah, cats tend to do that. That's very interesting.
Yeah. Well, they go where the warmth is, I think.
Right, okay. And lucky last, we have a lot of listeners who themselves would like to follow a career in history or perhaps write a book. Do you have any advice for them at all?
It takes patience. Yeah, I think it's important to perhaps use your sources wisely, or have a vast amount of sources that you can draw your story out of. I always say this to my students when they're writing essays. Don't start off with an idea that something happened and try to prove it, but do your primary research first, and then kind of your narrative will emerge from that. So it's much easier to do it that way than to try and make your evidence fit a kind of theory that you have in your head, really. Yeah. And always fill in your footnotes, because at the end of the day,
oh gosh, that is
when you're scrabbling, you can spend a lot of time looking for one tiny page reference. So
that is so true. Oh gosh, that's so true. Such valuable advice. And there is the very final thing that we do on the podcast, and that is, I normally call it a Tudor takeaway, but in this case, just a 16th century takeaway. So basically something for our listeners to go off and explore after the episode that might perhaps deepen their understanding of what we've been talking about, or just something nice to look at related to the 16th century. Well,
you can go away and look at Anne de Graville's works on Gallica on the BNF website. But what I was going to say was, because I have this interest in music, I also have an interest in Tudor music.
Oh, lovely.
So the works of Thomas Tallis and William Byrd, I love to listen to those. So I would suggest listening to Tallis's Speminalium, which is a 40-part motet, or his composition If Ye Love Me, or the works of his pupil William Byrd. His 4-part mass is something. I can't work and listen to music at the same time, but if I'm doing something mundane like checking footnotes, I'll put something on like that.
Lovely. I think that's a really lovely takeaway that we can all do. So thank you.
That brings us back to England as well.
It does bring us back to England, exactly. And Elizabeth, thank you so much for taking the time to talk about your work with us. And again, the book is absolutely stunning. I've read the introduction. I cannot wait to jump into bed to continue reading. So
thank you so much. It's great to talk to you. Yeah, it's lovely. Thank you.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining us. I absolutely love to hear from listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you'll also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. You'll also find me on Twitter. My handle is On the Tudor Trail, and on Instagram as The Most Happy 78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.